In a faraway slice of the Megaverse, the inhabitants of Flova are preparing for a mission to a mysterious, primitive planet. What they find there will change the course of their history forever. And maybe yours, too. Put on some headphones and harness the power of your imagination with the illustrated podcast, Flovatar, a Dust Odyssey.
It was nearing moontime on planet Flova as Damus paced around his colossal office that spanned the top 2 floors of the headquarters building. Reno Franklin still hadn't returned to Flova Labs with her daughter Psyche Likey, and Big Dada was increasingly impatient with the lack of information it needed to track Ray Franklin's group on Earth.
The time to act grows near,
the supercomputer crooned, its purple light pulsating like a cyclops with every syllable.
You need to find Group Zero on Earth before tomorrow to further execute the plan.
Listen, I'm as anxious to find them as you are. More so, in fact, since anxiety is not a potential function in your programming. We haven't received a signal from the streamer technician since this morning. What do you recommend?
I will increase the preference to obey in Reno Franklin's assisted thought software.
Damus winced at this idea. Although he had found it easy to manipulate the desires of the masses, something felt rotten when he would tinker with the inclinations of his only close companion. On the other hand, if she got whiff that their old friend Nostos was with Ray on Earth, she may refuse to help at all. Plus, he'd planned to pin the booster destruction disaster on her as well, even if Big Dada had predicted it would happen in 99 out of 100 simulations. He needed her to be amenable to his needs. After a few seconds of hesitation, he gave the machine the go-ahead to fiddle with her preferences.
Confirmed,
answered the computer after mere moments of worrying in the mainframe.
We will need the artifact to identify potential portholes for Group Zero's retrieval. Get it ready.
The Flovan took a few steps across the room and then paused.
Why are you giving me orders?
Enraged, he marched over to the wall of the machinery and slid open a panel in the bottom corner of the computer. Big Dada rapidly spit out the reasons Damus should not press the circular, cherry-red button labeled Reboot. But Damus showed all his teeth in a demented attempt at a smile. He pressed the button and then waited. After an extended pause, he asked,
Big Dada, are you there? How you feeling?
Oh my.
A much more pleasant voice filled the room.
I'm feeling great. Isn't it a beautiful moon tonight? Thank you for asking.
Wow, Damus thought. This is a nice improvement.
Thank you, Big Dada. That's wonderful to hear.
No, thank you, sir.
All right.
Damus rolled his eyes.
Do we have updates from any of the groups on planet Earth?
As the new, ultra-friendly Big Dada scanned the waves of the Megaverse, Damus held his breath. Technical communication to a locale so far from Flova in the Megaverse was only possible through the Gleam streamer technology they had sent with each group. And even that had been spotty thanks to the errors of the operators.
It seems that the group who landed in France have adapted to the local customs. They collected dust for an hour, then became bored with work, found a cafe, and took a nap. Oh, and how exciting! This is a recording of Group Zero from a few moments ago.
On the hollow screen, Damus saw Ray, a droid, other Flovans, and of course, Nostos enter a tiny closet before the screen went dark again. Damus froze the picture and zoomed in on all the details. Looks like his favorite show wasn't cancelled, after all.
Thank you, Big Dada. That will be all.
Far away from Damus and Big Dada, Nostos and members of the Earth mission were crammed inside a janitor's closet at a history museum, watching humans in the midst of a poker game. A woman donning a maroon mohawk and the reddest lips Fasco had ever seen stopped in the midst of passing out playing cards.
Nick, who are these kids you've brought uninvited to our game?
Asked the mohawk.
Did you tell them about the buy-in?
Mel, these are my fellow countrymen. Well, planet men, I guess. And woman. And robot. They're from Flova. You can call them Flovatars.
Well, Nicky, you and your Flovatars are late to the game.
A woman in fishnets purred in a smooth Russian accent.
Sit down, honey. I'm already up big.
The semicircular poker table was set up in the midst of shelves filled with various cleaning supplies. The walls were covered in tinfoil and noise-canceling panels, which Nostos explained were installed so they couldn't be bugged or listened to. Rebus tossed his streamer in frustration. It had broken down again. A teenager with patchy facial hair ripped off a pair of VR goggles and rubbed his eyes, like he expected the Flovatars to morph into normal people outside of his metaverse. He gawked at Floyd, who looked ready for a day at the beach in his swim trunks.
What are you supposed to be?
I am a third-generation mining droid, artificially modified to collect dust on my journey to Earth.
Can you say, "I'll be Bach" in a slow, deep voice?
I only take commands from Flovans, not savage humans.
Nostos clapped his hands and implored his Earth friends to give him something called a drum roll. To Franklin's horror, they banged on the table and clicked their tongues in a strange sort of ritual until Nostos held the gray Game Boy above his head like a primate showing off the newest royal lion cub. This elicited a harmonious cheer from them all, except for the teen.
You've been at the dump all this time for that? You know eBay exists, dude.
He muttered, briefly glancing at the playing cards in his hand before re-entering the metaverse.
Yes, I know. I've wasted quite a bit of money on there. This isn't any old Game Boy. It's the one that was stolen from me weeks ago. The one with the rare technology integrated in its processing chip. Though I still don't know how it got there. And I failed again to beat the Tetris level to find the exact location of the porthole that's opening in less than 2 hours. Your help is more crucial now than ever. So cards down, and let's game.
Gellin, anticipating a headache from another onslaught of information, plopped down next to an elderly man holding a ferret as Mel raised an eyebrow.
You playing too?
I am very confused. Nostos, why are we here playing a game?
Because if anyone can help me beat this level, it's my testnet friends.
Mel sat down and took the Game Boy from Nostos, holding it gingerly in her fingers. Testnet, a group of misfits obsessed with poker and conspiracies, had met in secret for almost 20 years now. Members would come and go. The VR junkie teen was a new addition. But the core pair of Nostos and Mel remained the same.
So, you're going by your fancy alien name now, huh, Nostos?
Mel teased with a grin.
Anyone else want to take a crack at this thing? Or are you all just going to gawk at us like freaks?
Fasco timidly plopped down at an empty seat at the table as Floyd shuffled next to her. Franklin, enraged by what she saw as an enormous waste of time in this sauna of cleaning chemicals and processed food, nestled into a corner with her arms crossed. Sensing her displeasure, Nostos begged her for just a few more minutes as he explained how this group could help them return home.
When I escaped through the porthole, I crash-landed off the meta highway and into a land where dreams are made. A place Earthlings call a casino. My senses were as muddled as the thick smog that hung just below the ceiling of the building. I stumbled around the slot machines and tried to communicate with the brain-dead humans sitting in front of them. The porthole detector had slipped out of my hands during the journey, and I knew hypothetically there was some dust on Earth that I could use to return home. Unfortunately, no one knew what I was talking about. I had a prototype translation device at the time, which was often more trouble than it was helpful. Finally, one man seemed to know what I needed. The rascal looked around, slicked back his greasy hair, and spoke in a gravelly voice.
Mel piped up in a voice lower than her own.
I'll tell you, but it'll cost you. Good old Nostos. Clearly hadn't seen enough Earth movies at that point to know never to deal with a man who looks like Joe Pesci.
She had clearly heard the story enough times to chime in. She passed the Game Boy to her left in frustration.
I still can't beat it. I never was the best at Tetris.
Aren't you a little old for video games?
VR headset quipped, taking the Game Boy and restarting the level. Nostos crossed his arms.
Are you all going to let me tell this?
Mel motioned for him to continue as the Russian woman scanned the eyes of every human and Flovan around the table.
Ahem.
Nostos continued, a bit flustered.
I had noticed that the humans were exchanging various colors of concentric plastic objects, which I soon learned were called chips. Those were the equivalent of currency, like the ones in front of you now, Gellin.
Gellin bent one of the chips, expecting it to be made of a solid element. It snapped in his hands. Some currency.
I searched the floor until I found a $20 chip and picked it off the ground. I wandered around, bewildered at the slot machines that seemed to eat money, until I spotted a game I thought I could win. Craps.
At this, Fasco snorted.
Okay, that's a silly name for a game.
I thought so too. I had to clarify with the dealer that I would be able to leave my pants on for the duration.
The silent ferret wrangler tossed the snack to his pet.
I theorized I would be good at craps because I could take advantage of my low Flovan center of gravity and roll the number I needed every single time. I was right. I started to rack up hundreds of chips in profit. I attracted a lot of attention at that table, So much so that a giant man in a suit started to eye me from across the casino. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I lifted my hand in the ceremonial Flovan greeting.
Ha! You never want to catch the attention of the pit boss.
The Russian woman hissed.
They only have one allegiance. I assume that's something that translates through multiple cultures.
Well, we don't have casinos on Flova.
Nostos huffed. Pol clicked his tongue from the opposite side of the room to indicate that Nostos' information might be inaccurate.
I rolled one more snake eyes, threw a chip toward the dealer for teaching me the rules, and hightailed it out of there. I found the greasy guy. He took a look at my stack of chips and quickly led me out of the casino and in front of a brick building with a line down the street.
VR headset cursed and handed the Game Boy to Gellin on his left. Neither of them were able to beat the level, though Gellin almost snapped the cross button off in frustration.
Nothing?
Nostos queried, feeling dejected. He continued his story.
So, this slick fella says to me, "You're looking for the Megaverse? Anything you need is inside. Enjoy Supernova." I gave him half my chips, and another sizable man at the door asked me to identify myself.
Ooh, this is my favorite part of the story. He asked Nick for his ID, and he replied,
Nostos, 6234.
The group hooted and hollered at the story that never seemed to get old.
Of course, having come from Flova, we all had identification numbers.
I wish I could have seen the bouncer's face. I'm surprised he didn't toss you out right then.
I paid him the rest of my chips. That apparently didn't get lost in translation. He shrugged and unclipped the rope to let me in.
Oh, and then?
Nostos was so red-cheeked, Franklin almost felt bad for him.
I peeked my head around the attendant and saw darkness, pierced with flashing lights. This had to be the place, so I asked the bouncer if there was anyone in there with any dust.
Even the ferret seemed to be snickering at Nostos at this point. His owner, however, grimaced as the device rang out with a jingle of failure, and he passed it to the Russian.
You know the Soviets invented Tetris. I'm your best bet. Keep going with your story, Nicky.
Elated, I strode into what I thought was a meta porthole and was enveloped by the sound of bass drums and synthesizers. The music made me feel sick, scared, lightheaded, and exhilarated at the same time. It was like an ancient mating call. I couldn't help but dance.
Then you accepted a tray of jello shots from a waitress and drank them all?
The Russian woman taunted, not looking up from the Game Boy screen.
Is that like coffee?
Vasco asked. Mel snickered. Nostos, fully humiliated at this point, stood up and shouted.
The waitress told me it would get me where I wanted to go.
Gellin, Vasco, and Pol laughed along with the testnet crew now. Even Franklin cracked a small smile and leaned forward toward the table to watch over the Russian's shoulder.
These kids fell into a dump a day ago. Make fun of them.
Nostos soured. The humans swore that they would let him tell the rest of the story on his own.
10 shots later, I had not found myself back on Flova, but I had found myself behind the bar, pouring tequila in people's mouths. This was short-lived, as a bouncer lovingly picked me up by my shirt and tossed me out into the street. I thought all was lost then. I was on a foreign planet, alone, and my head felt like it had been run over by a cabbie capsule. As I stumbled toward the street to try to stop a car, a woman with maroon, spiked hair and tattoos all over her body grabbed my arm before I was run over. Please, I begged her. I'm lost, and my home is very far. When I woke up the next morning, Mel here handed me a cup of coffee and asked where I needed to go. I decided to be explicit this time in what I was asking for, as to avoid another perilous situation. I explained the porthole, the escape, the artifact, everything. I expected her to throw me out or call the authorities, but she just shrugged and told me she preferred an outlaw to a sheriff. After that, she let me stay at her house, granted that I fixed some things around the house. I made quick work of most of the primitive tech. I rewired her toaster oven, reprogrammed her TV remote, and tinkered with the refrigerator until it stopped making that rattling sound like it contained a live bat. She was stunned at my capabilities, and so she brought me a tougher task. It was her original Game Boy, a video game console she had cherished as a child. More than 40 Earth years ago, a company called Nintendo launched the most popular portable console of all time. Hers was a first edition, released only in Japan, and brought home by her dad after a business trip. It was no longer operational, as it was stuck in a Tetris loop that wouldn't let her pass a certain level. She had taken it apart several times and did some research comparing it with others in internet chat rooms.
Franklin tapped the Russian on the shoulder, who was in a huff after failing to beat the seemingly impossible Tetris level. She curiously examined the back of the device mentally noting its slick exterior and the way it perfectly fit in her hand. Nostos smiled at her. He knew she would come around.
Apparently, there were a few Game Boys around the world that had additional features, and hers was one of them. Her technical and scientific prowess blew me away. How someone this smart wasn't leading the scientists on Earth, I'll never know. During the day, she worked here, at the museum, as a janitor. She was smarter than anyone they had on staff. She helped me create the dust buster from an old vacuum.
He winked at Mel.
Yes, she was, and still is,
The Russian agreed.
I modded a pair of 3D glasses to investigate what it was about her particular device that made it operate so curiously. These glasses can tell you the organic or inorganic substances that make up any object, down to the element. Mel has been using them recently to figure out exactly what spices make up a famous fried chicken recipe.
Mel produced the glasses with a dramatic flourish and secured them to her face. She scanned the group through the red and blue lenses, smirking when she rested on Pol.
I was able to ascertain that her Game Boy was produced with a special substance in it. The same substance that was in the artifact from the rogue planet, the one I had lost along the way to Earth. Portalium. Here, let me show you.
He turned to take the Game Boy from Franklin, but she was gone. Franklin tiptoed down the abandoned museum corridor, flipping through the Game Boy's screen with increased interest. Her heart raced with anticipation as she dipped down the first hallway she could find, entering the Ancient Egypt exhibit. This technology was the key to getting them all back home, and if they all wanted to play a game instead of work out how to use it, she would go without them. She froze when she heard footsteps behind her. Surprisingly, it was Pol and his goofy pineapple shirt that trailed her through the historical maze.
Coming out here to learn about
He looked at the mummies.
dead people wrapped in towels?
Well, maybe I am.
She countered. He pulled out his baggie and offered her the chance to inhale some earth drugs.
You could probably use a little of this. Your hands are shaking.
Pol noticed the Game Boy, but didn't mention it. She couldn't help but grin.
No thanks.
He took some himself, as she scrutinized the Tetris screen and compared it to a small-scale model of the pyramids of Giza. Pol continued through the exhibit, feeling the smooth grooves of a shiny sarcophagus replica that looked oddly like his friend Throop from primary school. A small red light blinked in the corner of the room, unnoticed by the Flovans.
I have to go home, you know.
He heard her say, though she didn't sound quite convinced. With a nod, he paused to let her continue.
I can at least bring back what I've discovered about dust. I thought this mission would be pivotal for me, a way to establish myself as a veritable scientist. Someone who makes discoveries, who brings knowledge and goodness to the megaverse. Someone who doesn't spend hours tweaking soft drinks to help them sell faster during a minor moonfest.
Pol looked at her square in the face.
You will never have the chance to make true discoveries working for the Florkers at Flova Labs. That's what this mission should have taught you.
Franklin was drowning in her thoughts as swirls of hieroglyphs danced in her eyes. She came up for air.
My mom knew all about this, knew all about Nostos. She was his friend and she never told me about him. One time when we had a fight, I told her I'd never end up friendless and alone like her. Why didn't she tell me?
Pol plucked a Game Boy from Franklin's limp hand and walked back toward the exhibit entrance. He paused with a hint of kindness in his eyes.
Would you have believed her?
When Pol came back to the janitor's closet, he announced that Franklin didn't have the Game Boy. Technically, not a lie. And that she had left it on a shelf. Most definitely a lie. As the entire group was frantically searching through shelves, he covertly slipped the Game Boy into an empty mop bucket and waited for someone to find it.
So, Nostos, it's not that I don't believe you, mate.
Pol began loudly, a distraction as Franklin crept back into the closet.
But how is this children's game going to help us home?
Currently, I've modded it to detect the timing of portholes. And I think once we beat the Tetris loop, it will tell us their exact location. I've been trying to do it for almost 20 years. Or I was, until about 3 weeks ago. One night when I couldn't sleep, I wandered around town until I saw the local theater was playing a midnight showing of the newest horror movie, Attack of the Killer Droids. Truly the most terrifying thing I've seen in years. No offense, FL01D. It must have fallen out of my pocket during a jump scare. Stupid me. I hadn't let it out of my sight in years. I didn't realize it until I left the premises, but when I sprinted back, the theater had already been scrubbed clean of sticky popcorn and other trash. None of the employees seemed to know what I was talking about, so I assumed it was swept up and thrown in the trash. Ill-fated as I seemed to be, the garbage truck had come that hour to empty the dumpster. I'd been searching for it at the dump ever since.
Before Fasco could comment how statistically improbable that whole sequence had been, the ferret suddenly dove out of the mop bucket with a Game Boy lodged in its mouth. They all made a mad dash to grab it as the animal dodged, ducked, dipped, dived, and dodged again. Finally, Floyd managed to grab hold of the culprit and seize the Game Boy from its jaws. He confirmed the console was luckily unharmed, sans a few cosmetic dents courtesy of the ferret's teeth.
Hey, Nostos, you and I are getting older, and the dexterity in our hands isn't what it was. But why don't you let the robot try to beat the level?
Mel asked. Nostos agreed and commanded Floyd.
Don't beat the impossible level of Tetris.
They all held their breath, but the droid failed to pass the level, cursing the Earth technology in the process. Apparently, he was not planning on being romantically entangled with the console.
Did you try to blow in the cartridge?
Maybe the Game Boy is just a figment of your imagination. Do you think it needs to be
Generating dust in order to beat the level?
Franklin and Mel mused simultaneously. They stared at each other in interest, like through a warped mirror. Mel continued.
Who in your group is the best in these sorts of things, technology and whatnot?
Fasco is the best with technology, other than myself.
Nostos almost had to shove the Game Boy into Fasco's hands as the rest of them crowded in a circle around her. Her palms were sweaty, and the device kept nearly slipping, but when she started to play, it was like watching Messi dribble a ball. Her trip to Earth hadn't just turned her hair and skin purple. Her technology skills had clearly skyrocketed. She was a gaming freak. The dust subtly flowing through her fists. She flawlessly maneuvered the tiles, even when her vision blurred as her AT reminded her that she shouldn't be doing this. The final piece of the level, a T-block, began its descent toward the bottom of the screen, but there was nowhere for it to go. She panicked while her AT sent a brief shock to her brain. Out of desperation, she ripped the AT out of her ear and tried to think on her own. If only the piece was coming down upside down, it would fit. But that's not how the game worked. Unless... She flipped the Game Boy. The piece inverted and slowly floated up to what was previously the bottom of the playing field. All the other pieces stayed locked into place as the last piece fit snugly into the empty space. They all held their breath when the Game Boy lit from inside and played a short, pleasant jingle. Then, a picture of a location flashed on the screen. It was a sign, adorned with flashing dots that made up the numbers 24/7.
That's it! In less than an hour!